Hello and good day. Our topic for today is different types of investors. Of course, investors have differences. They are different in terms of way of thinking. They also differ in terms of behavior when it comes to making investments. And that is the purpose of having this topic for today in order for us to differentiate the types of investors. There are three different types of investors, and they are first, conservative investors, second, moderate investors, and third, aggressive investors. I will discuss these different types of investors one by one. Ang unang type ng investors ay tinatawag na conservative investors. Conservative investors are investors who seek stability when it comes to investing and are more concerned with protecting their capital than increasing its value. In other words, these conservative investors are investors who value principal over seeking appreciation of the value of their investments. Ang ibig sabihin ng appreciation, increase. Increase ng value ng kanilang investments. Ang kabaliktaran ng appreciation ay depreciation. Ang ibig sabihin naman nun, decrease. Itong mga conservative investors, gusto nila na safe ang kanilang principal or capital. Gusto nila stable. Mas binavalue nila yung pag-protect ng kanilang principal or capital rather than yung pag-increase ng value ng kanilang investments. Hindi nila actually aim na makakuha ng higher returns. Dahil ang gusto ng conservative investors ay safe na principal, as a result, they are normally willing to accept lower returns in exchange for capital preservation associated with short-term funds. Actually, among the three types of investors, ang conservative investors ang investors na nagtitake ng lowest risks. At dahil sila yung investors na nagtitake ng lowest risks, that means sila din yung investors na nakakakuha ng lowest returns. These investors are comfortable in accepting lower returns for a higher degree of liquidity or stability. In other words, they are not aiming for higher profitability but rather higher degree of liquidity or stability. That's why okay na sa kanila na kahit ang makuha nila ay low returns. Typically, conservative investors primarily seek to minimize risk and loss of principal. Sabi ko nga kanina, sila yung investors na nagtitake ng lowest risks. That's why they are constantly seeking to minimize risk in their investments. And of course, aside from minimizing the risk of their investments, they also want to secure their principal. Conservative investors are the ones who preserve their resources and do not take risks that compromise their equity. Kapag sinabing equity, that is another term for capital. Recall your basic accounting equation. A is equal to L plus E or A is equal to L plus C. Assets are equal to liabilities plus equity, or assets are equal to liabilities plus capital. That's why equity is another term for capital. Para sa mga conservative investors, gusto nila na hindi ma-compromise ang kanilang equity. That means, gusto nila na maprotektahan ang kanilang capital or equity. They want their investments to be safe. At dahil gusto nila na safe ang kanilang investments o safe ang kanilang capital, hindi sila basta-basta na nagtitake ng risks. Losses and lack of liquidity are out of their plans. It says here, losses are out of their plans. As I said earlier, conservative investors primarily seek to minimize the loss of their principal. That's why losses are out of their plans. Aside from that, lack of liquidity is also out of their plans. Ang ibig sabihin niyan, gusto nila yung mas liquid na investment. Actually, mas preferred nila yung liquid na investment over yung investment na makakapagbigay sa kanila ng higher returns. Para sa mga conservative investors, liquidity over profitability. Safety of the principal over appreciation of value of their investments. Most are beginning investors who avoid risks and have short and medium-term objectives. Karamihan sa mga conservative investors ay beginning investors. Kasi ang sabi ko kanina, ang conservative investors, ito yung mga investors na nagtitake ng lowest risks. Kapag ang investor ay beginning investor or nagsisimula pa lang as an investor, of course, ang ititake niya na risk ay yung lowest risk. That's why most conservative investors are beginning investors. For example, as a beginning investor, nag-invest ka ng 20,000 pesos. Of course, as a beginning investor, gusto mo na safe yung 20,000 pesos mo. Of course, i-invest mo yan sa low-risk investment kasi nagsisimula ka pa lang naman. Pero yun nga lang, kapag invest mo siya sa low-risk investment, ang matatanggap mo lang as an investor ay low returns. Aside from the fact that most conservative investors are beginning investors, most conservative investors have also short and medium-term objectives. In other words, these conservative investors want to achieve their objectives after a short period of time. Meaning to say, their objectives are not long-term. Gusto nila na kapag nag-invest sila ngayon, after a short period of time, ma-achieve na nila yung kanilang objectives. Gusto nila, after a short period of time, makakuha na sila ng low returns. The second type of investors is called moderate investors. Moderate investors value reducing risks and enhancing return equally. Para sa mga moderate investors, gusto nila na ma-reduce or ma-minimize yung risk and at the same time, ma-enhance or ma-increase yung return na kanilang makukuha. Unlike sa conservative investors na kung saan, yes, gusto nila na ma-reduce yung risks, pero yun nga lang, okay na sa kanila na kahit mababa or sobrang baba yung return na kanilang makukuha. Compared sa conservative investors, ang mga moderate investors kasi, they are willing to risk more in order to have or get a higher return. Yung risk na kanilang tinitake ay mas mataas kaysa sa risk na tinitake ng conservative investors. So as a result, dahil mas mataas yung risk na tinitake ng moderate investors, of course, mas mataas yung return na kanilang makukuha. These investors are willing to accept modest risks to seek higher long-term returns. Take note, ang sabi dito, higher long-term returns. Unlike sa conservative investors na short and medium-term objectives. That means short and medium-term returns. Moderate investors may endure a short-term loss of principal and lower degree of liquidity in exchange for long-term appreciation. Ang mga moderate investors, ito yung mga investors na kaya nila na kahit magkaroon ng short-term loss of principal. Yung mga conservative investors kasi, they do not have or they do not want to have a loss of principal. Losses are out of their plans. Pero kasi sa moderate investors, kaya nila na kahit magkaroon ng short-term loss of principal. Aside from that, moderate investors may endure a lower degree of liquidity. Diba, sa conservative investors, gusto nila yung mas liquid na investments. Pero dito sa moderate investors, kaya din nila na kahit yung investments ay nakakapagbigay lamang ng lower degree of liquidity. That means okay sa kanila ang less liquid na investments. Moderate investors may endure a short-term loss of principal and lower degree of liquidity in exchange for long-term appreciation. Para sa mga conservative investors, ang aim nila capital preservation. Dapat maprotektahan ang kanilang capital. Pero dito sa moderate investors, they are aiming for long-term appreciation. That means in a long run or after a long period of time, mag-i-increase ang value ng kanilang investments. Moderate investors are more concerned with relative yet stable growth in excess of those provided by conservative funds. They are willing to tolerate more fluctuations in exchange for more reasonable returns, but are still not comfortable enough with market risk to invest their funds aggressively. Meaning to say, although ang aim nila ay makakuha ng more reasonable returns, yung risk na kanilang tinitake ay hindi kasing taas ng risk na tinitake ng aggressive investors. Because they are still not comfortable enough with market risk. Yung return na kanilang nakukuha ay hindi kasing taas ng return ng aggressive investors. Pero yung risk na kanilang tinitake ay mas mataas kaysa sa risk na tinitake ng conservative investors. The moderate investors who take a slightly higher risk are looking for a return that is higher than the market average. Kaya nagtitake ng mas mataas na risk ang moderate investors kasi gusto nila na mas mataas din yung return na kanilang makukuha than the market average. When moderate investors assume a slightly higher risk, they can achieve profitability above the market average. These investors tolerate some risk, but they also cherish their equity. Yes, mas mataas yung risk na tinitake ng moderate investors kaysa sa conservative investors. And yes, mas gusto ng moderate investors na mas mataas ang return na kanyang makukuha. Pero it doesn't mean that these moderate investors don't value their equity or capital. They know the market a little better and diversify their objectives between short, medium, and long term. Compared sa conservative investors, mas maraming alam ang moderate investors when it comes to investments. And aside from that, meron din silang pinagkaiba when it comes to objectives. Para sa conservative investors, ang objectives ay short and medium-term objectives. But for moderate investors, short, medium, and long-term objectives. Their investments have a slightly higher risk than conservative investments, but as a result, they are able to yield slightly above. Gaya ng sinabi ko kanina, they are willing to risk more in order to achieve a higher return. But take note, yung risk na kanilang tinitake ay hindi kasing taas ng risk na tinitake ng aggressive investors. At yung return na kanilang nakukuha ay hindi kasing taas ng nakukuha ng aggressive investors. Eventually, moderate investments can have negative returns depending on the economy. The third type of investors is called aggressive investors. Aggressive investors value maximizing returns and are willing to accept substantial risk. In other words, ang priority ng aggressive investors ay profitability. Ang gusto nila, sobrang taas na return. At dahil ang gusto nila ay sobrang taas na return, they are willing to accept substantial risk. Meaning to say, they are willing to take higher risk. Actually, among the three types of investors, ang aggressive investors ang investors na nagtitake ng highest risks. These investors believe that maximizing long-term returns is more important than protecting the principal. This means this is the opposite of conservative investors. Di ba kasi sa conservative investors, ang aim ng conservative investors ay capital preservation or protection of the principal. at hindi profitability. Pero sa mga aggressive investors, ang aim nila ay profitability over capital preservation. Aggressive investors may endure extensive, significant losses. Sa mga conservative investors, ayaw nila na magkaroon ng loss. Sa mga moderate investors, okay lang na kahit merong short-term loss. Pero sa aggressive investors, kaya nila na kahit magkaroon sila ng sobrang laki na losses. Liquidity is generally not a concern to aggressive investors. Kabaliktaran na naman to ng conservative investors. Kasi sa conservative investors, liquidity over profitability. Pero sa mga aggressive investors, profitability over liquidity. Aggressive investors are more drawn to higher levels of risk in exchange for higher levels of capital growth. They are comfortable with fluctuations over the shorter to medium term as long as they can achieve their objective of substantially increasing their real capital value over the long term. Ang ibig sabihin lang niyan, sila yung pinaka-exposed sa mataas na risk. Of course, normally, because they want to get the highest return, they must be willing to expose their investments to higher risks. These are the investors with the highest risk because they seek the highest possible profitability. As they have more experience in the market, they understand that the daily oscillations balance in the medium and long term. These investors have a higher percentage of the wallet in variable income than moderate investors and prioritize the return on investment. Among the three types of investors, ang pinaka-experienced ay aggressive investors. At dahil mas malawak na ang kanilang experience when it comes to investment, alam na nila kung ano ang kanilang gagawin sa kanilang investments. Of course, because they are willing to risk more or they are willing to take the highest risk, of course, mas mataas yung variable income na kanilang makukuha than the moderate investors. As I said earlier, ang priority ng aggressive investors ay profitability. That's why it says here, these aggressive investors prioritize the return on investment because the return on investment is a profitability ratio. That means isa yan sa ginagamit na ratio para ma-assess yung profitability ng investment. Actually, para makuha yung return on investment, the formula is net income over investment. The aggressive investors are investing in higher risk investments. Bakit sila nag-i-invest sa higher risk investments? Primarily because the higher risk investments are the investments which give them the highest profitability.